So I think I counted up about 10 different lies in your book, give or take a few. And we won't have time to go into all of them today, but I was hoping we could get into a few of them and encourage the listener to go and buy your book, because then they'll be able to get all the information. All the chapters are great, and you have lots of different topics. There's a few that I really wanted to talk about, though. The metabolic lie would be one of them. Can you tell us what the metabolic lie is?
Yeah, the metabolic lie was that when I went to medical school, I was taught that metabolism is just sort of the way that food was digested. The role of metabolism is just to digest food and convert it into energy. Since then, I don't think that anymore. I think it misses the whole point with metabolism. I think metabolism, and this is based on some discoveries that weren't made until the end of the 20th century and are still being discovered in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And that is fundamental metabolic proteins like mTOR and all, and the dramatic effect they have. This is a metabolic protein that drives metabolism. It's influenced by metabolism, but it actually drives each of these chronic diseases and longevity itself. It's really a remarkable protein. But the thing with metabolism is, I think it's fundamental for all these chronic diseases. And as we talk, you probably talked about metabolic syndrome as underlying metabolic abnormality that's at the root cause for, all these: obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease. And when we say, there's a famous quote that 88% of adult Americans are unhealthy. Well, they're unhealthy because they're metabolically unhealthy. Their metabolism and the way they process foods is abnormal, partially resulting from due to diets and all. And this abnormal metabolism, this metabolic unhealth, is what's driving the chronic diseases that we see today.
Yeah, and I would challenge anybody to go walk through the store or an airport or any public place and just try to count the people that aren't obviously, suffering from metabolic syndrome. Like you said, one of the criteria is waist circumference. It's pretty easy to tell that people are very unwell, and it's hard to find people who aren't these days. It's so prevalent that it's become, normalized, because it's an average, but it's not normal at all.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We're now in a society where being normal is abnormal. In other words, most adults in America are either overweight or obese. Those are two different levels, depending on overweight is less than obese, but it's still abnormally high amount of weight. So when we look at lab values and markers now, I always caution people that you don't want to be in the normal range anymore, because most normal people are sick. So what you want to be is in an optimal range. And you've probably talked about that before, but it underscores the fact that that so many people are sick today, and most people don't realize that they're sick. I think the 80% of people that are metabolically unhealthy, many of them think they're fine because they're told by their doctors they're fine. A lot of the diseases that we'll talk about, I used to believe that the diseases were like a switch, that you either, I got Alzheimer's, okay, that person has Alzheimer's, okay, or they don't, or that person has type 2 diabetes, or they don't. That person has, cardiovascular disease, or they don't. I think it's more like obesity. When is a person fat? Well, we all know that it's a slope, and at some point we'll draw the line and say that the person's fat. But actually, what I've come to understand is that diabetes works the same way. And our doctor has a threshold for diabetes, an HA1C value of that they can measure, or a fasting glucose. And when it's above a certain value, you're diagnosed as type 2 diabetes, and then the doctor can prescribe medicines. They get paid for the visit. If it's below that value, you're not diabetic, and they tell you, hey, you're not diabetic, don't worry about it. But what happens is, over time, all these diseases, in my opinion, diabetes, even Alzheimer's, it's a ramp that goes up years to decades before the doctor actually tells me that I have the diagnosis. It's been going up all the time. And the challenge for all of us is to look closely at our situation and our lifestyle and begin to treat these diseases decades before they actually. Don't wait for the doctor to tell me I'm a diabetic or that I have Alzheimer's or don't wait until I get a heart attack, or a
Right.
stroke. These things are brewing in our system, and it's all about prevention.
Yep. And we learned to treat things like diabetes by treating the glucose when it went too high. But like you said, that's been a ramp of 20 years of the insulin slowly creeping up and up and up and up to the point that now it can't do the same job for all of this glucose. And the glucose flies out of control. If we were only looking at the right measurement, the right metric, we could track it a lot earlier. But you're right, there are so many clear warning signs that people can be paying attention to so that they can get out in front of this.
Yeah. And one other thing about type 2 diabetes, which is the elephant in the room, really, because type 2 diabetes is a driver for Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is called type 3 diabetes because of the association. Diabetes drives heart attack, stroke. It drives cancer, all these things. It drives mental illness. So diabetes is the elephant in the room. And I used to think that, fine, diabetes was a switch. Maybe it has a ramp of 10 years, but you either were on the path to it or not, based on your genetics or not. And the A1C, I think you probably talked about that before. It's a blood test that measures the damage done to our bodies by glucose. And the higher it gets, the more damage. And once it crosses a certain level, you're diagnosed with diabetes. There was an interesting study that came out recently. It was looking at adult Americans who are not diabetic. And it looked at large populations of patients from the Framingham study and the NHANES study. It looks at upwards of several thousand, almost 10,000 patients, I think. But what they found was that for people who are not diabetic, their marker of diabetes, this HA1C blood test, actually with aging goes up. It goes up and up and up over aging, with aging as a normal feature of aging. So I've changed my thinking now that I think that type 2 diabetes is basically, it's like gray hair. In other words, it's something we see with aging that everybody gets. If they live long enough, they don't die of something else. Sort of like prostate cancer for guys, if you live long enough, everyone will get it. And so how does that influence my thinking now? Well, it just means that everybody should think of themselves as on the path to diabetes and look closely at their markers for insulin resistance, their HA1C, and then translate that into their lifestyle. And that means, as I'm sure you've talked about, the three major food groups, one causes diabetes and two don't. Two are essential and one isn't. The one that's not essential is the one that causes diabetes. So thinking that we're all on the path to this insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, we need to think very carefully about limiting the food group that drives type 2 diabetes.